The airport was built, like I say, probably in about 1944 or 45 when they started it. It was about that period of time. And that was all farmland over there when they bought that ground up. And they moved several houses from over there, some along the road over there as you go from the square on Greensburg Road over toward the road that goes back to the airport. Three of those houses were moved there from over on the airport land. And they took and filled in, they put great drainage tiles in, and then of course they leveled that ground all off. But that was all farmland. There was, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 big farms back in there in those days. And of course they brought the big machinery in and worked that ground down to where it's level. They could make runways. And my grandmother's place sat right under the end of the north-south runway there. And back in those days, they didn't have jet planes. They had 4-engine propeller planes that were the planes that flew the passengers. And when they would take off at night, they would light up the whole house as they took off, because they weren't very high when they came off the end of the runway, because the runway just, a house practically set down under the end of the runway, a little ways off the end of the runway. And those motors would be roaring, and you just hear that and the lights lighting up as the plane went up. As I recall, there was about 4 major airlines there. There was one called Capital Airlines, Eastern Airlines, American Airlines, and I can't think of the 4th one, but there was 4 major airlines, and they all flew 4-engine passenger liners in those days.
We used to have a fair every summer where we'd take our animals and they'd get graded, and you'd have vegetables and out of your garden, and then you'd also have your farm animals, your produce, and then we'd have the Queen of Green contest, we'd have the Tiny Tots, we had games of chance, but they were all homemade stuff. They weren't like the professional things that are there now, and it was run by, if you weren't a nonprofit or associated with the school or the community, you weren't allowed to have a booth. And the favorite one was dunking the teachers or the football players or the cheerleaders, and great horse show at the fair. They had to stop that after a while, because the animals, by the time the 80s came around, there weren't a lot of farms left that had animals to bring. So we stopped having them. And my husband, Charlie, was the president of the fair. And people would bring the animals and wouldn't even come and water them or feed them the whole weekend of the fair. So the board decided not to have it anymore, the animal.
When I was growing up in Greene, the land was mostly farmland. So we were known as a farm school because everybody lived on a farm. And if you didn't live in a farm, you lived in suburbia USA. So everybody had at least a half an acre of land, and their houses weren't on top of each other. But you knew who your neighbors were, and you kind of hung out with your neighbors, and you were able to stay out late at night because your parents knew where you were. And it was a safe place to grow up, and it was a great place to grow up. As a teenager, I went to Greene High. I was part of the graduating class of 1976. We were known as the party class, but I'm sure since then there's been classes that have taken that title from us. An interesting fact about my high school years, when I was a freshman, we were probably the first and possibly the last that they actually split in half. The intermediate school was the high school at the time, so they sent half of us to the middle school, and the other half of us stayed at the intermediate, which was also known as the high school. Now, if you were in the freshman class that was over at the middle school or the junior high school, and you were in band, you actually had to walk back over to the high school to take that class. When I was in school, the education plan and the classes were different. They had OWE, which was a work program. You went to work half a day and went to school half a day. They also offered a program called IOE. It stood for Intense Office Education. You could take it with or without shorthand, or if you had the college track. So you had to choose before your junior year if this was a program you wanted to take, and then you stuck with it until you graduated.
We had a small orchard when I lived again up on Arlington Street. We had a small orchard and we made cider and apple butter there often every year. I had quite a small property, but it was long and narrow, and we gardened on there also. And we raised a lot of our own food, and my mother prepared it, canned it. Then freezing became an option. I remember selling it out at the street. I had like a stand, and people could get corn, and mostly corn. And what else? I was in Scouts. I remember that very fondly. It was a good program. A couple of the leaders were, of course, from the community, and I remember doing that. One rate, I started in the 7th grade. I would ride my bike to Turkey Foot Golf Course, which was out 619. Do you recall where that is? Mm-hmm. And I worked there for 50 cents an hour. I worked in the clubhouse. So I would work in the clubhouse, put golf carts out, work the counter, clean and sweep. And
we played games. We played kick the can and cops and robber. Where the dance studio is, there used to be a house up on top of the hill. And we'd start up on top of the hill, and we'd come down the hill and get on the sidewalk and go clear down to where Mr. Brammer had down there by the apartments. We used to fish for suckers in the creek in the springtime.
We rode bicycles all over the place, and there was traffic, but nothing like it is today. We could just go most anywhere. A lot of times we walked. Before we got bicycles, we walked. We worked for farmers to earn a little bit of money. We mowed some grass, and sometimes we'd get a make-up ball game. We'd get 4 or 5 kids and go find a pasture field and get a baseball game going. Or we'd walk to a pond and fish.
I was in the 4th grade when the building caught on fire. That was an 8-room school building, and about half of it burned. The front half toward Greensburg Road there burned down. They were able to save the back 4 rooms and use them later on after they got them all cleaned up. And I had forgotten that the cafeteria was in that back section. My brother told me that we used to go down to the cafeteria, and I do remember that, but I'd forgotten to use the cafeteria there in the grade school building because there wasn't a cafeteria over in the high school building. The teachers discovered smoke one day out in the hallway, and they were just trying to decide what to do. They knew they wanted to get the students outside, and they were trying to figure out what to do, but just then the recess bell rang and everybody filed out, and of course we all stood around outside and watched the fire department try and put the blaze out.
Mr. Babb, he had, that building's not there anymore, but there was a pattern shop, and him and a bunch of guys got together, and they had an old 57 Chevrolet that they put a water tank on it and made a fire truck out of it, and they met down in the back underneath the pattern shop is where their fire department started.
And then later they got an old bus chassis, and they stripped the bus part off and welded tanks up and made themselves a water tanker for the fire department. So they had a fire truck and a water tanker that they could use. And as time went on, then across the corner there, I think it's a library now, isn't it? There was a library at one time on that other corner. That used to be the fire station. They eventually got enough money together to build a fire building there right on the square there, right behind that memorial thing there. And it was still a volunteer fire department, but they got better trucks and that sort of thing.
One of the places that I enjoyed going to as a kid was Green Gables. They were located on Maslin Road where the Greenview Inn is. They were one of the biggest restaurants in Green. They were in business for more than 50 years until closing their doors in April of 1999. It's got to be the biggest change is growth. The population, the amount of people, and the amount of businesses that are here now. way, way busier than it ever was when I was a kid. And I also feel that the people have changed. We don't have that a close, small, bourbon feeling tightness that we used to have 20 years ago.
Pig farms and lot of dairy farms. And we raised horses and cows because we had a little 55-acre farm. And all your orchards out here had apples, cherries, peaches, and pears. You didn't have just apples like a lot of them do now, and then they bring in cherries, but they had all the fruits. And be very cheap to live out here because there was no tax rate because we were a city. Now it's one of the most expensive places to live.
Dale Breidenthal owned a Ford garage there where I think there's a market there now, and they've got the garage all boarded up right across from what used to be the old EUB church there. I'm not sure what they call that now, that church there. But Breidenthal sold Ford automobiles there. And I was in, I think, my senior year, took driver training. They were just beginning to start to have driver training for people to get their driver's license. And we had a car. It was donated by Breidenthal's Ford there. A Ford car. It had dual controls. It didn't have a dual steering wheel in it, but it had a dual clutch and a dual brake. And of course, in those days, the automatic transmissions weren't real popular yet, so it had what we call a stick shift. It had a manual transmission. And before they changed the intersection out here the way it is now, coming in from the east there as you came into the square, you kind of had to come up a little bit of a grade to the traffic light. And I was driving, and I stopped, and there was a dump truck ahead of us stopped at the traffic light. And I pulled up and I stopped behind it, and the guy in the dump truck stalled it as he went to start out, and he started drifting back, and I looked and I saw there wasn't anybody behind us, so I put the car in reverse and started to back up to keep him from backing into us. But the driver instructor was sitting over there with both pedals down, the clutch and the brake pedal, and the car didn't move, and that dump truck rolled back into us and smashed the front end of the car in. So I felt so bad because I was driving, it wasn't my fault.
Well, when I first moved to Greene, it was the country. And it was the country. There were very few lights on any of the roads, and it seemed to be more farmland than there were any of the like housing. And then all of a sudden, more houses came and more houses came, so it grew really fast during the time we lived here. There was less traffic, but I guess I like things being convenient. There were almost no stores, and you would have to drive someplace to get to it. Not a city. It was a big deal. We became a city, and I couldn't figure out why that mattered. But now we do things, or before we didn't do things. Or like the concerts at Bettler Park, or the picnics at Bettler Park. That really, now Greene used to be, the way I looked at it when I moved here was, well, it's just a kind of a bunch of neighborhoods cobbled together. Now Greene's becoming a little bit more of a community, and that's nice.
Had you ever heard of a place called the Hog Farm? Really a big part of the history of early Greene. Probably a good 20, 30 years. They raised it went from Arlington back to Pickle Road, almost down to 619 on the south. And I don't know how far, not to Killian up north, but anyway, filled in that area. And they ran pigs, and they would bring wagons out of garbage from Akron and feed the garbage to the pigs. It was owned by the city. And the smell was, I remember it very young, and people really wanted to get rid of it, but it was a hard thing to pull off because, we were Greene Township and Akron didn't want to listen to a township. So between the flies and the smell, it was something else. And in the summer, you knew you were close to something like that. So they would bring the wagons out. Again, wagons, not, well, they probably are motorized, but early on, they probably were pulled by horses. And they would drive back behind where the movie theater is. They would drive all through back there and feed this garbage from the restaurants and places in the city. And the city owned the farm or rented it.
Okay.
It was farmland in the township, but the city either owned it, leased it, something. And this had started early on. I remember the family talking about going to meetings at the school at East Liberty. They would have community meetings and call them and try to be amicable going to the city, but they had to really get forceful and go in there in numbers and whatever. But in those days, they might have just prevailed on the city by going personally in and saying, look, this is not good.
I like going to the farmers markets. I like going to the church festivals. I like being able to utilize just the recreational facilities and being able to walk, being able to bike the trails that we have, newly developed, and I'm very pleased thus far with the school district. Primarily the quality of the teachers and the attention to growing good kids holistically, looking at the big picture all the way through. And I think it reflects a lot of the Midwestern values that we aspire to.
And I know that you're a counselor in another district. Do you think that Greene has a very good district compared to other districts?
I think it's comparable overall. I think our teachers care about kids. I think that the resources that are there are comparable as things change in education. I'm hoping they stay that way, but for the most part.
What would you say is the biggest change you've seen in Greene since you've been here?
Probably the landscape of the city. We have been here since it was incorporated as a city, and there's been a lot more development, a lot more focus and attention on green space, creating parks, creating business, and developing the area. I like that we are focused on growth, but I also like the fact that I believe our city government is looking towards enhancing a good place and continue looking for a good place for families.
I also remember going to a theater. I believe it was called Theater 815. Across the street from it was the Theater Dance Center. I only went to the theater if me and my sister were finished with all of the work for the week. We went on Saturdays, and I remember getting ice cream afterward as well. I had a ton of fun then. I remember having the flag. It was split into 5 parts. There was a bird, a barn, a family, a tree, and buildings. Now they have a symbol. I like the flag better. I liked the old Greene then better.
Barber shop. George Garman was the postmaster and the barber. And you'd be sitting in there getting a haircut, and somebody would come in, and George would say, excuse me, and he'd leave you, and he'd go over and sell the people stamps or mail a package for them. Then he'd come back and finish cutting your hair. There was the barber shop and half of it, and the post office and the other half, because they didn't have mail delivery in Greene. That's why south of the square there, the people had the address of North Canton, because they got their mail through North Canton. And just like you folks here have Uniontown for your address, you get your mail out of Uniontown. There was no rural mail delivery or mail delivery in town Greensburg. They had post office boxes. They had to come to the post office. They'd have a box number. They could, and I don't know if they had a key or had a combination they could open their thing. And their mail would be in a little cubby hole there. But, and off of the post office and the barber shop, the back part there, the Garmin family lived back there.
You've been a baseball coach for the Green Baseball League. Do you enjoy that? Did you enjoy that a lot?
I did that for over 15 years, and I enjoyed coaching the children, watching them grow. A lot of them playing for high school, and the most importantly, the parents were very supportive and helped out in every way they could with the team and the players. Also, the community spirit, everyone working together and helping each other out has been a very had a big impact on us and why we've stayed here, and us helping out as well.
Compared to Green to other cities, what do you think is the thing that really stands out to you?
I think the thing that really stands out here is the community, people helping people. That's kind of what's really permeated here within the community is, you know, if you have a neighbor needing help or somebody else, they step in and help each other out. And someone's always willing to help each other out, and this really impressed me about the community. So.